So the theme of my lectures in this summer school is validation of cyber-physical system. So from formal to semi-formal, I started with something formal, showing that perhaps we should do something semi-formal, in the sense that we would be able to do more, like a larger system, more complex system, and more problems. And now, so that is the two first lectures. So the last lecture is more like how we can use all these techniques, computational techniques, for other problems than validation. And we can also see this as kind of like when for the problem of validation, that means that we have already some model, and then we would like to validate the model against some specification. And here is that we assume that we don't have the complete model, and then we would like to complete that model, like in some sense. For example, if the model has parameters, then we would like to synthesize parameters to make the model valid with respect to some specification. And also we would like to see here that in fact the control and parameters in this framework is they are closely related, in the sense that we just consider that control are mainly time varying, and parameters can also be seen as time varying, especially when we would like to design or to synthesize parameters for some system that will be used to explain some phenomena, and also to predict. So especially this is will be illustrated with application to biological modeling. So this is the work I have done in collaboration with some colleagues, some biologists, and also with my colleagues and my students at Verimag. So basically, here is some ideas about biological modeling. So we would like to have some mathematical models. So basically, they're used to understand some biological phenomena, or to they can be used to predict, or for other purposes, like for example, even when you want to test some medication, or when we would like to study, for example, different phenomena, for example, epidemics, or so you have different levels. So here, basically, for the first level, it's like micro level. The second level, metabolic reaction, is more in molecular levels, and population studies more like population, truly people, or some animals, populations of animals. And here, so we have some characteristic of the process of establishing biological models, is that we have some phenomena with different phases. So for example, in this phase, something with some specific phenomena, and then a sequence of phases. And also we don't have, we can use a lot of like biology, knowledge of biology and chemistry to establish the mechanism to like the first to found the first equations of our system, but we do not have all the information, so we need to do a lot of experiments, and we have only experiments from data. So the idea is now is from data, how can we show that, okay, my models match the data. So first of all, like finding some parameters, some uncertainty in the structure of the system to match the model, and then also to validate some hypothesis about the system. For example, I would like my model, normally I'm studying some process, so if I do this, then I should observe this. So is the model able to reproduce that kind of behaviors, for example? So what I mean here is that I would, in particular, consider dynamical system as the model, as the foundational models for this process. And I would consider here especially hybrid dynamics. That means that dynamics that combines continuous and discrete dynamics. So it's in particular appropriate for all these multi-phase processes. So we can have a different type of models. For example, we can have discrete time, we can have continuous time, and also we can have the hybrid in the sense that we can have continuous and evolution and jump evolutions. And so the idea here is that we will have to use some knowledge about the biological system to establish first some equations. So for example, we would consider especially the variables of our system are concentrations of some species, for example, or some quantities, and then we will use the structure of the pathway to establish the equation, especially using some known laws, for example, kinetic laws. You have mass action and Michaelis-Menten laws, for example. And then in this, when we have these equations, of course, we have a lot of parameters in there. For example, when you have to produce the reactions between the interaction between two substrates, and then how to produce a new substrate, then we have these coefficients that very often we don't know the exact values. So very often we would leave those parameters unknown, and then we'll try to find the values of the parameters using experiments. So from experimental data, we will try to estimate the parameters. Either we use the extrapolations of experimental data to find the parameters, and also we have another biological meanings of parameter is that they can model varieties in our biological system. For example, you can use the same models for different populations. So we have these varieties, for example. And because we have these parameters here, so we have some sort of uncertainty, and that's why the idea of this approach is that we would like to exploit the strength of formal methods. That means that we can do something more exhaustive to handle uncertainty in this type of problems. Especially, for example, we will use the computation of tubes of behaviors that what is exactly called flow pipes, for example. And now, first of all, I would talk about the parameter estimation. So parameter estimation, so some parameters, for example, reaction rates or production coefficients, so they have some biological meanings, okay? So they will describe something. But you also have other parameters that, in fact, they come from the approximation only, okay, or from data fitting only. And the idea of finding parameter estimation here is that we try to find a value or set of parameters values so that we will be able to minimize some errors between the data predicted by the model and the true data measured by experiments. For example, that is what is called fitting. And measurements here can be noisy, for example. There's something very usual. And that is the first problem of parameter estimation. The second problem is model revision. So model revision is that we have already models, but now we have new data. Okay, so then maybe we need to revise the model. We need to find different set of parameters in order to capture, to feed new data. Or we'd like to have more precise in data fitting. So here, that's why in this approach, we would like to improve the quality of fitting. Especially, we would like to consider, normally the parameters, they are constant value, and we would like to consider parameter as time-varying functions. So it's very similar to control synthesis here. And in the purpose that we would like to see the effect, the physical effects of the parameters. And it's not only like some the effect, a mathematical effect on the behaviors of the system. So now I would use one particular example, and this is a pretty real-life example in the sense that it's not from a textbook. It's a case study from our project, French national project, CAT Media. So this project, the goal is to understand the effect of iron in the production of blood cells. And so here is some, in our simplified, in these simplified versions of models, we have a number of like entities, like irons, heme, globin, and then hemoglobin. And then we would like to have they interact between each other, and we would like to see the effect of iron to the production of hemoglobin. Okay, so then we have here the different parameters here that between the reactions between the entities.
Just a question. Those are chemical.
Yes.
Emissions.
Okay. Yeah, entities. Yeah. So basically, in our equations, the variables are concentrations or number of molecules of this. So the experiments. So for example, the idea is that we would like to see now if the effect of iron. So we put some iron that we can truly measure. So that's why we would have radioactive irons. We add, and then we wait 3 hours, and then we measure. Okay, so we will do another experiment, but this time is longer. The waiting time. I mean, we let the time. Longer time. And then also, for example, in the middle, we can add some other thing, and then we will wait, and then we measure. So that is a typical procedure of this analysis. So about the equations. So now we have these equations. When we have now no radioactive species, then we have only 4 equations. So each variable is the concentrations of, for example, iron, heme, globin, and hemoglobin. And then now we add like radioactive species, then we will have more equations. You have like before we didn't have these variables, and now we have more variables. And this looks very much like a hybrid automaton. Then we see that we have a different modes. So in each mode, which the transition to another mode after, for example, waiting time, after adding something, after measuring something, for example. That is it. And now our idea and our problem formulation is that we have. We'll see that here, for example, just look at this as a hybrid automaton. In each mode here, we will have a set of differential equations. And also, what is particular about this differential equation is that they don't have the same dimensions. That means that because when you add something, you will have more variables. Okay, so that is only a detail like modeling details, but this is very important too in terms of computations, because we need to handle that very efficiently. We should not like treat all the time the system in full dimensions, for example. So then we have a hybrid automaton. We have in our hybrid automaton, we will have different, for example, here. We have here, for example, this is the the iron that we add to the system. That can be considered as input. And also we have parameters in the reaction rates here, for example. So the idea is that we would like to, given this hybrid automaton, given data, okay, so on the measures, and then we would like to find the parameters or to find the inputs like the input iron input to our system, so that the behaviors predicted by the model would fit the data. Okay, so that is now the idea is to simply formulate the data fitting error as objective function, and then we'll see that we'd like to find the parameters or to find the controlled input so that we will minimize the error. So it's exactly the optimal control problem. So now I would not go into much detail, but it's the idea because in this summer school we have heard a lot about reachability, about reachable set, how to represent set and all that. But here the idea is different. It's a different view of how to represent the evolution of the system. So here instead of have a set representation about all those reachable states, then we will have a measure about the reachable set. So that means that this measure is very closely related to a lot of ideas about the performance functions, or also closely related to probabilities, or also other geometric notions like volumes, for example. So we would like now, instead of computing on the reachable states, that means that the states that the system visited during the execution, we would like to measure, to give like the occupation measure of this. Given a set, what is the occupation measure what is the time the system spent on that on that set? That is the idea. So we will have some, first of all, some measure. So the measure is the classical definition of measure. So that means that the measure defined for set X. So if the set is empty, then it's 0. And then we will also have this property concerning the disjoint collection of set, for example. And also now given for the dynamical system here, we have a dynamical system, we will have the dynamics derivative, which is a function of time, of the state, and of the input, okay, input u. Okay, now it's we will define now it's a occupation measure for the system starting from some initial set. And here is simply it's defined like you have this reachable set, and then you have this level set representation. That means that the system, based on the indicator function, if the one state is inside a set, then the indicator function at that state is 1, otherwise it's 0. Okay, so and then now here we will integrate over the indicator function. And intuitively, this measure defines the time the system spends in this set. Okay, this set is here is delta. Delta is the time interval, the state of the system, and the input. Okay, so the combination of the. So I would say. So now what is interesting is here is that we would have. Okay, we will define some linear operators over. For example, given some text, continuously differential function v, we will define some linear operators and also adjoint operators. They are very classical things. So basically, the idea here is that with this, we can see that, let me see if I have more. Okay, so the idea here is that if we look at the final time, okay, so it's the conservations of information. If we look at the final time, here's the initial time. Here is something like in between. And then we have some conservations. Okay, and then let's go to something here is more interesting here. So that is the, now if we have the dynamical system, we have the Liouville equation, it will tell us that, okay, that is the final measure at the time, given some time, a final time t. And then here we will have something initial, and here is, everything is like derivatives, you know, the changes in the measure. And then in a more like a compact way, we can write it simply here. It's like to say the evolution. This operator is about the evolution of the measure. So what is interesting is, maybe I'm not going, this is we can also use the same idea about the conservations of information to extend this conservation to the hybrid system. That means that with the discrete transitions, that means that before the transition and after the transition, we need to preserve the amount of information. So let me just give here the cost function. So now we don't compute the reachable set. We compute this measure, okay? And we would formalize the cost function, for example, here as a sum function over the state and over the input, also some fixed cost function at the final time. Here is for all the time until the final time. And also we see that in our system we have different types of measurements. So we measure after some 3 hours, after some 5 hours. So then we don't have only one final times. We have many final times or many intermediate time points. So then our objective function is a little bit more complicated, and it changed a little bit the formulation of optimal control solution. So here we will have the sum over all the intermediate time points, and also we have this running cost is the integral. So now let me give this only this idea. So from this optimal control problem that we formulate here, using this Liouville equation. So the Liouville equation is linear with respect to all the measure functions that we want to find. But it's a infinite dimensional problem because we need to find a function. It's not the only points. So the idea here is a pretty well-known idea, is that we can try to relax the problem into a finite dimensional problem. That means that, in fact, we will define a lot of functions, polynomials. You will use polynomials, and then we will, instead of, if we have like infinite degree of polynomials, well, we will converge to the exact solution. But if we don't want to, it's impossible to handle such polynomials, then we fix some maximal number of degrees, and then we can handle transform our optimal control problem into polynomial optimization, and using like techniques, for example, from semi-definite programming. And so here's the idea is truncating the degree, and we have some convergence result is that if we increase the degree of polynomials, then we will be able to converge to the exact results. So now if we are back to this hybrid automaton of hemoglobin production, so we have here at the beginning we have only 5 variables, and then we have 8 radioactive species. We have 9 variables, and then we may have 5 again. Basically, we will have some hybrid automaton with differential equations, polynomial differential equations. And we would like to to minimize the fitting error in the intermediate points. So we will use something which is greedy in the sense that, okay, I will try to minimize first the first point, And then I use the control up to that point, or the parameter up to that point, to minimize the next point. Okay, so this is a greedy approach. It's possible to prove the convergence for some cases. Okay, not all the cases, some cases. And, well, because otherwise we'll need to, if we want to use like global, to truly assure the global optima, then we need to enumerate all the possible sequences of transitions, and it's very costly. Okay, so then that is the idea. So we use this greedy approach, and we apply this greedy algorithm for our hemoglobin production automaton. So just to recall that we have 11 continuous variables, 7 data points, that means the intermediate time points, and then also we have two different continuous modes, but in our automaton we have more location. It's just the modes to say that we have 2 different types of dynamics. And then, so basically that is the data, experimental data that we want to match. So now that is the result that we have. So we have the results which the generated optimal control, optimal in the sense that we use our greedy approach. So they are green here. So we give that to biologists. They say that, yeah, but our parameters, maybe they are not so like piecewise constant like that. We cannot have like, we would prefer something smooth, something. So then, in fact, we use, so the first generated optimal control to try to, we would add some approximation there to find a better, a smooth function that is close to that generated function, and then still satisfies the error bound that we fixed. Okay, so and we do that with two different functions, piecewise polynomials, and also Hill functions. So the Hill function here comes from the biological intuition, is that we expect to have some kind of like activation or switching behaviors here. So we have these Hill functions. So that is also to show the quality of data fitting the errors between the behaviors predicted by the model and the experiment data. So we show here some errors. For example, if we use the control generated by the algorithm, the error is good. But in terms of like physical or biological meanings, these controls are not so good. So if we use some functions which are closer to the intuition of the biologists, we will increase the errors, but we will have better, more meaningful models. So now that is the some conclusion for this part. How much time do I have? 5 minutes.
10 minutes.
Yes.
How much time do you need?
Well, I will just show something a little bit different. So that is the we just talk about how to synthesize control or parameters for our system to match data. So that means that the specification here is kind of like to minimize some objective functions. But we can also consider other things. For example, we would like to have some like STL, some temporal specification, and we would like to find parameters in our system so that the behaviors will satisfy some this kind of STL formula. So for example here, what did it say? So here is that is the formulation for the problem. So we give an STL formula, and also that is that we will enjoy the remark of Taylor this morning, is that we will need to consider here not only single traces, but we need to handle set of traces, to the interpretation of the STL on sets, so that we can handle parameters in our, because each parameter would correspond to one trace of the system. And so we have, the idea is that, first of all, we will, for all these atomic predicates, then we would try to find parameters. For example, here we'll reduce to kind of safety properties. So that means that we suppose that we start here. The system, our system, will have this like a valid so far up to now, like a set of parameters values, and then we would like the next step. Okay, if we apply the dynamics of the system from this set under this set of parameters, we would like that in the next step the system is safe. That means that safe. That means that doesn't violate this specification. So in that sense, that means that we will compute the reachable set from there. We'll see that part of the reachable set is not like correct with respect to this specification. Then we will try to cut the parameter set so that we will restrict our system only to this correct behavior. So that is the atomic predicates. So then we can extend that to handle all these like implications on the STL formula. And for example, in terms of this kind of like solving this elementary problem in our algorithm, we can use, for example, optimal control solution that we proposed earlier. And so then we will have the difference. So here is just the algorithm to show how we can handle the STL for the parameter synthesis. And if we apply the model to different epidemic models, for example, here is that the idea is that we have some disease, and then we have some population in some area. So then how they interact between sick people and healthy people. And we also hospital infrastructure to evacuate people. And then we'll define the parameters on that in order, for example, we'll try to limit the number of sick people for some periods. So, and then they have this kind of behaviors often can be represented using STL. And we use this approach to, for example, try to determine the behaviors in our, determine the parameters in our system. So here's the formula, for example, is quite complicated. Like I is the number of, I think that is the, so all this S is a sick people, or some, you have the meaning of this population. And then the population, you have, if the population is smaller than 20, and then we'd like some untien properties, and also we have other different untien properties. So untien properties here is something more complicated to handle in this synthesis. So that's why we use this also nested until to evaluate the performance of the algorithm. Yes, so that's it. That is what I want to explain in this talk. It's a little bit chaotic. And so basically, we have the ideas that we would like to find parameters and control synthesis to match, to be able to match data, and also to conform the system to some temporal specification.
Thank you very much, Thao. Any questions? I have a quick question. There was recently some work by Rusu from TU Wien on biological systems and modeling different cells and so on. Are there connections between this work and the work done over there?
There are a lot of work on
okay.
biological
There's a lot
models,
of related work.
But what is the specific about that?
Actually, I don't remember the technical details, but it seemed that there could be some connections. So I was wondering if it's as related as it looks. Are you familiar with that work, or you hadn't
No,
come across it? Okay.
no. Yeah, no, yes.
It could be completely unconnected.
Yeah,
but,
so this work is motivated by the fact that, well, by this hemoglobin production model. And we use the measures, occupation measure, because it's trying to find something exhaustive and optimal is very difficult. So it's good to formulate the problems using some approximate solution to find an idea about the solution, like for example, all these input functions, and then from there we would try to rectify using the knowledge of the biologists. For example, they would tell us no, it's impossible, and that we will have jumps like that.
Yep.
So then we will try to smooth, to make, to use more smooth functions.
Yeah, I think that now that I had a chance to remember it, their models were mostly about cells, and I don't know if that's kind of at a smaller granularity or smaller scale than this work, or if this is also
Basically, it's
cell processes.
the same. This is also for cells.
About the cell level.
Yes,
Yeah,
and also for population. It's the questions of how you would like to, like how many substrates, for example, if on the cellular molecular levels, or in population also it's just by the number of the size of populations. But they are the same ideas on this
Very good. Thank
mass action.
you. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Thank you. Any other questions?
Yes.
So you use measures to synthesize the control inputs and also estimate parameters. What particular measure is mostly used, or it doesn't really matter? So is it a Bohr measure or
No, it's this measure that we defined here. The important thing is that we can transform differential equations into a linear equations over measures that measure. They are measure functions, so that now you have to play with functions. And if you restrict the functions that you want to look for into, like for example, polynomials with some degree, then we can find a approximate solution. But of course, I mean that you can, the important properties that you have convergence. You know that, okay, if you cannot find functions that will allow some errors, then you increase the degree and you look again. Okay, so, and the measure here should be defined this way. It's the occupation measure. Yeah. It's similar to volume.
Other questions? Yeah?
No, thanks. It was nice. On the first part, I had a couple questions on the occupancy measure, just trying to better understand what it means. So there's a fixed time bound, is that correct?
It's
Like up to some time t?
no, the equation of the Leuven equation is for a finite time. You have one finite time.
Okay.
And then we establish the equation. So the evolution, the measure at the initial time, the measure at the final time, and what is the evolution of the measure.
Mm-hmm.
And the equation is linear with respect to the measure functions.
So, okay, so but you fix that final time a priori?
Yes, yes,
Okay,
yeah.
okay, kind of like
This is
sometime
the specific to, for example, data matching, because you know exactly at what time you measure.
Okay, okay. Yeah, because I had related questions like what happens if it's a stable system or an unstable system, or if there are deadlocks and other things. But yeah, so that answers most of those questions since it's time bounded. Then maybe today was some of the first time seeing it, but what relationship do you see between the parameter STL and hyperproperties things?
Hyperproperties are more general. Parameters so far is, for example, if it's in the time interval of the STL formula, it's very complicated to handle. If it's in the predicates, it's easier to handle. And then you can have even like continuities of the robustness for some STL formula with respect to parameters. But if it's in the time interval, it's more complicated. And the hyper properties, I think, is more general way to talk about set of behaviors. Yeah.
Very good. Any other questions? All right. Well, since this is the last talk, thank you very much for taking time from your busy schedule and coming to speak at the school.
I'm sorry about
this-
all these
Oh,
messy slides.
no problem. These things happen.
My
Thank you very
slides
much,
disappeared.
Thao.
I don't know why.
It's a small thing. I hope you will
Okay,
enjoy
thank
it
you.
when you're back home. Thank you.